So this is the first of our snippets. Remember, we sort of ended our discussion with some comments about race and the Constitution. And since we're going to be doing phoner next week, I'm going to try to sort of move very, very quickly through some of the key elements of constitutional history between what we did on Monday and what we're going to be doing next week. And so this first snippet is going to look at really the battle in late 18th and especially early and mid 19th century between an emphasis on slavery in terms of understanding constitutional development and an emphasis on union. And we were talking really, I think, in both of those sections about this issue of compromise and slavery and the convention, and to give the framers the greatest benefit of the doubt. One of the assumptions that they made was that slavery probably would wither away. This, as we all know, didn't happen. But to their, I guess, on the credit side in terms of interpreting them, in terms of constitutional history, really for the first 30 years or so of the U.S., it is this sort of nation building and union that is the dominant approach, and the critical element here is Chief Justice John Marshall, who is appointed by John Adams, the Federalist. Justice Adams is leaving office and will serve as Chief Justice for 3 decades, and really establishes the Supreme Court as the entity that we know today. Before Marshall, there had been 3 Chief Justices. It had really been a very, very low profile position. And so quickly moving through some of his key decisions, the most important Marshall decision is this case called Marbury versus Madison. The specifics here really aren't all that interesting. The problem was that Marshall had a political difficulty. He could side with Marbury, who was an appointee of the Federalists, who James Madison wanted to fire. And Marbury, on the basis of the law, had the better point, but that would be a politically difficult decision. Marshall is a Federalist. It's clear the Federalist Party is in decline. This would sort of be like if Trump got to make a Supreme Court nomination in November or December or something, there would be a sense that this person is highly partisan. Marshall doesn't want to appear to be highly partisan. And so in the end, Marbury versus Madison comes down to this key element here, which is that Marshall gets out of it. Marbury sues basically by saying that the withdrawal of his commission violated the Judiciary Act of 1789, which it did, and that the Judiciary Act of 1789 allowed a person who lost their job under these circumstances to sue in federal court. Marshall says not so fast, that the Supreme Court is going to conclude that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional, and therefore Marbury's lawsuit was invalid as a whole. He doesn't get a job. So Madison wins on political grounds, but institutionally, what Marbury versus Madison establishes is the principle of judicial review. It says that the Supreme Court, not state legislatures, not Congress, not the president, the Supreme Court is the ultimate interpreter of what the Constitution means, and how the Constitution applies to specific disputes. Another key precedent from this era, the other prominent Federalist on the Supreme Court, is this guy Salmon Chase, who was a much more partisan figure than Marshall. And Jeffersonians in 1805, 1806 attempt to remove him from the court for a variety of reasons. Basically, they just didn't like his decisions very much, and they impeach him. And the question in the Chase impeachment trial, impeachment is this very vague clause in the Constitution. The question is, does the fact that a majority of Congress disagrees with the opinions of a Supreme Court justice, is that sufficient grounds for impeachment? Chase is ultimately acquitted. He will go on to remain on the court for several years thereafter. And the precedent here is that Congress just can't impeach someone because they disagree with their ideas. Exalting the power of the national government is a major theme of the Marshall Court. This is a rendering of the Bank of the United States, the forerunner, sort of, to the Federal Reserve Board. The Bank of the United States is chartered in 1796. It is rechartered in 1816. Each for a 20-year term. It will be allowed to expire in 1836. After the second rechartering, which is quite controversial, the state of Maryland passes a law allowing it to tax the Bank of the United States, which is, again, it's a federal body. And in this famous decision called McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, the Marshall Court says a right to tax is essentially a power to destroy. It's a limitation on state power. Basically, what Marshall is saying is we're dealing exclusively with federal power. The states do not have the legal authority under the Constitution to tax federal entities. And the goal of the Maryland state legislature seemed to be to impose a very, very high tax on the bank as a way of driving the national bank out of business. And Marshall says no. So basically here we have a choice between state power and national power, and Marshall moves towards national power. And this is, this is really a recurring theme in the Marshall Court. There is one exception to the pattern of the Marshall Court, and that's the Cherokee cases. So this is a county map of Georgia from the early 19th century. These counties are all still in Georgia: DeKalb, Gwinnett County. These are both just north of modern-day Atlanta. But all of northwestern Georgia, as you can see here, was Cherokee County, given to the Cherokees under a treaty with the United States that was signed in the 1790s. One of the provisions of that treaty is that this land belonged to the Cherokee, that white Americans could not purchase land in this territory, but the Georgia government basically said, we're not going to adhere to it. And Georgia's argument was, look, we didn't sign the treaty, and so there's nothing you can do to force us to adhere. And the President of the United States at this point, Andrew Jackson, is sympathetic to the Georgia cause. So the Cherokee sue in federal court, and the argument that they make is that the U.S. government, by signing this treaty, has an obligation to prevent the government of Georgia from stealing their land. And the decision, which is the last major decision of the Marshall Court, called Worcester versus Georgia, says absolutely that's correct, that the Cherokee Nation it's an independent entity within its boundaries. It's subject to the jurisdiction of the national government as a result of this treaty, but the laws of Georgia can have no force, the Marshall Court says. Georgia says they're not going to follow this. President Jackson says if Marshall wants to enforce the order, he can he can raise an army to enforce it. The decision ultimately comes to naught, and the Cherokee, as we all know, are forcibly expelled from Georgia, and many of them will die as they're resettled into Oklahoma. So this is the first theme of constitutional history, really, really quickly, from the early part of the 19th century, this establishment of the court as the barometer of interpreting the Constitution in a series of decisions from Chief Justice Marshall, and there are several others that I haven't mentioned here, that maximize federal power, that maximize the power of the right of contract, that create a more conservative vision of society. This is President Jackson, who defies the Supreme Court order in the Cherokee case. The second major theme, though, eventually will predominate, and that's the theme of slavery. And the first time this plays a major role in American history comes in 1821. And the backdrop here is that Maine, my home state, seeks to declare its independence from Massachusetts. There was no, if you look closely here, there's no boundary connection between Massachusetts and Maine. Maine citizens believed that they were not being represented by Massachusetts. So Maine petitions for admission to the Union. It has a sufficient level of population. Massachusetts is okay with it doing so. Maine is clearly going to be a free state, and the Southerners object. They're worried if you get 2 additional senators from Maine, that will tip the balance in the Senate towards the free states. The Speaker of the House at this point is Henry Clay. a Whig from Kentucky, border state. And Clay proposes the Missouri Compromise, which we all know, but it's essentially the first attempt to deal with slavery in a legislative fashion that's a kind of constitutional approach. And the Missouri Compromise allows Maine in, but admits Missouri as a slave state, so keeps the balance in the Senate as it was. Creates this Missouri Compromise line of 36-30. Areas below that will be slave. Areas above that will be free. This looks like a pretty bad deal for the South, but Arkansas is expected to be the next state to be admitted to the Union, and most of these areas here in the North are not terribly well populated. The Missouri Compromise postpones consideration of the slavery issue, but not for much longer. And increasingly, I think, to me, the theme of mid-19th century politics is the way in which slavery comes to consume all aspects of American political discourse. This is a drawing of a famous debate in the Senate called the Webster-Hayne debate from 1830. The nominal issue here is the tariff. And Daniel Webster was from Massachusetts, a senator, conservative, supporter of a high tariff because he believed that that would help American businesses. He was debating a South Carolina senator named Robert Hayne, who was a supporter of a low tariff. South Carolina exported agricultural goods, but really the issue here was slavery. South Carolina said that it, as a state, should have the right to nullify. This is the nullification debate. Federal laws. Webster says no, and in this very famous line, he says that the issue here is the people's constitution, the people's government made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. If that phrase rings a little familiar, Abraham Lincoln will refashion it in the Gettysburg Address during the Civil War. Hayne, on the other hand, strongly defends states' rights. And then finally, international affairs become subsumed to this debate over slavery. And to me, if you ask the question of when the Civil War becomes inevitable, it's basically 1844, when James Polk wins the presidential election on a platform of annexation of Texas, triggers the war. With Mexico, which the U.S. wins. The U.S. seizes this disputed area, the western, basically half of Texas, and also seizes all of these areas in blue, which creates a significant constitutional question: what to do with these new territories. And the preview of things to come comes in this measure introduced by a Democratic congressman, so same party as Polk, but an anti-slavery figure rather than Polk, who was pro-slavery, named David Wilmot, called the Wilmot Proviso, which said that all territories seized from Mexico, so all these areas here in blue, would be automatically non-slave. The Wilmot Proviso passes the House, but it never passes the Senate, and so it will postpone the consideration of this issue for some time to come. So that's our first snippet, and our second is to come.